Welcome back, my fearless fiends, to Curtis's Corner, the place where nightmares come to life and the shadows whisper your darkest secrets. Today, we are continuing our bone-chilling journey into the history of horror with part 4 of our spine-tingling series. And trust me, this one is going to send shivers down your spine. We're diving headfirst into the years 2000 to 2013, where horror didn't just evolve, it exploded, reinvented itself, and turned the genre upside down. This era was a strange, dark playground where everything you thought that you knew about fear was challenged. The dawn of the new millennium brought us a fresh wave of terror, one that blurred the lines between reality and nightmare, and twisted every trope you thought you understood. Torture corn? Oh, it's here. Found footage? Absolutely. And paranormal horrors? You will never sleep again. And let's not forget the reboots. Oh yes, the classics were resurrected in ways that made you question whether nostalgia was really a safe place. From the relentless scares of The Ring and Saw to the terrifying new world of Paranormal Activity. This was the time when horror got more immersive, more visceral, and more real. Not just in its shocks, but in how it made us feel. And don't even get me started on the serial killers in space, the blood-curdling home invasions, or the zombies stumbling their way back into the spotlight. This era was all about pushing horror to the extreme, blending old-school terror with fresh, twisted takes. This period saw filmmakers daring to throw all the rules out the window, and taking us to places that felt just a little too close to home. It's not all blood and gore. Some films got under your skin in ways you didn't even know were possible. So grab your popcorn, because part 4 is about to drag you through the darkest corners of the 2000s and 2010s. And trust me, there is no coming back from this ride. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button if you are ready to face the horror lurking ahead. Subscribe for your weekly dose of terror, and don't forget to ring that notification bell, because you'll want to know when the next scream is coming. Want a front row seat to the madness and have a say in what's next? Check out my Patreon. Just $2 gets you early access and exclusive content. Alright, let's stop wasting time. It's time to plunge into part 4, the 2000s and 2010s, where horror got grittier, smarter, and more terrifying than ever. Ready? Let's get spooky. Scary Movie from 2000 is the horror comedy that laughed in the face of its slasher predecessors and came out on top. Directed by Keenan Ivory Wayans, it took everything terrifying and turned it into something absurdly hilarious. Imagine Scream, 1996, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, 1997, being stalked by a killer who has no idea how to keep a straight face. From the opening scene that totally rips off Scream, to the absurdly hilarious "Do you like scary movies?" line, Scary Movie parodied everything that made 90s teen slashers so iconic. It's like a funhouse mirror reflection of horror, distorted, over the top, and just a little bit out of control. What makes Scary Movie so influential is that it took the horror genre and gave it a giant wedgie, all while making it impossible to take yourself seriously. Not only did it poke fun at Scream's whodunit thrills and the Blair Witch Project's found footage shaky cam nonsense, but it also set the stage for a new era of horror parodies, where the horror genre had to learn to laugh at itself. This movie didn't just make fun of horror, it celebrated it with a big, goofy grin. It's the best kind of self-aware comedy, one that doesn't hold back on the ridiculousness, but still knows how to deliver on the genre's thrills. The success of Scary Movie unleashed a flood of sequels. Scary Movie 2, Scary Movie 3, the list goes on, especially with the 6th one coming out later this year. And it gave birth to other spoof comedies like Epic Movie from 2007, Date Movie from 2006, which tried to keep the absurdity going. But Scary Movie's biggest legacy, it helped pave way for films like Shaun of the Dead from 2004, Cabin in the Woods from 2012, and Scary Movie style parodies in general. The idea that horror could be both funny and genuinely scary, yeah, Scary Movie totally got there first, throwing its own party with horror cliches and laughing while wearing a chainsaw as a costume. In the end, Scary Movie wasn't just a spoof. It was a revolution in horror comedy genre. It showed that you could take everything you loved or feared about horror, be it creepy killers, haunted houses, or creepy phone calls, and make it ridiculous in the best way possible. Plus, it gave us that I see dead people joke. And honestly, who doesn't want to relive that iconic moment? If you're wondering where horror and comedy learn to hold hands and skip down the street together, look no further than Scary Movie. In the same year, Final Destination came out, and it stands as one of the most original and influential horror films of the new millennium, thanks to its radically different take on the genre. Rather than focusing on a mass killer or supernatural creature, the movie introduced a far more insidious villain, death itself. The premise was simple, yet terrifyingly effective. Survivors of a horrific accident realize they've cheated death, but soon discover that it doesn't take kindly to being outwitted. Death isn't just a mysterious force, it's a relentless, invisible predator that comes for them in increasingly bizarre and horrific ways. This concept tapped into a primal fear. No matter what you do, you can't escape your fate. And let's face it, if Final Destination taught us anything, it's that even a seemingly safe trip to the dentist can turn into a life or death game of Russian roulette. What made Final Destination so influential wasn't just its premise, but how it delivered tension in a new way. It wasn't about building suspense through jump scares or supernatural elements. It was the slow creeping dread of watching characters realize they're powerless against a force that can strike at any time from anywhere. Every ordinary moment became a potential death trap, whether it's a malfunctioning roller coaster, a flying shard of glass, or even a seemingly innocent drive down the road. I still have nightmares about that log truck. It was a masterclass in tension, making you hyper aware of every minor danger in your environment, even things you'd never thought twice about before. A casual glance at the ceiling fan? Now it's terrifying. In terms of influence, Final Destination reshaped the horror genre by removing the human antagonist and making it the concept of fate itself the primary antagonist. It inspired a slew of imitators, from its own sequels to movies that explored similar ideas of inescapable doom. Films like The Final Destination in 2009 cranked the death sequences even further, finding new ways to kill characters in increasingly elaborate and often absurd ways. More broadly, it influenced horror films like The Cabin in the Woods 2012, where unseen forces manipulate the fate of characters, or It Follows in 2014, where an unstoppable, faceless terror quietly stalks its victims. Even the Saw franchise owes a debt to Final Destination for turning the concept of a relentless killer into a way of exploring fate, morality, and survival. But perhaps the biggest impact of Final Destination was how it fundamentally changed the way we view everyday life. It made us question the mundane and turned the most routine activities into potential death traps. Going through the motions, traveling in a car, sitting on a plane, all became fraught with tension we never noticed before. The film's brilliant combination of fate-driven horror and grisly creativity made us all aware of something terrifyingly true. Maybe it's not the what that's trying to kill us, but the how. And just like the characters in Final Destination, you're left with one question. When your time comes, will you see it coming? Or will you, too, just be another victim of an invisible force that never gives up? Jason X from 2001 carved out its own space in the slasher genre, and in doing so, helped solidify the slasher in space trope that would come to define a certain brand of over-the-top horror. While the idea of combining slasher villains with science fiction was certainly not brand new, Jason's intergalactic escapades brought a fresh and delightfully absurd spin to the concept. What made Jason X stand out is how unapologetically it took Jason, the ultimate camp slasher, and tossed him into a futuristic setting where he could wreak havoc aboard a spaceship, slashing his way through an unsuspecting crew. The result was an energetic, campy romp that pushed the boundaries of what the Friday the 13th series had been known for and simultaneously redefined what a horror film could do in space. While Jason's space adventure might have seemed like a ridiculous leap at the time, it set a new bar for the slasher in space subgenre, paving the way for future film to explore the potential of mixing horror with science fiction. It wouldn't be long before other films followed suit, often embracing the same brand brand of absurdity. Jason X's influence can be seen in films like Leprechaun, Back to the Hood from 2003, and even Leprechaun Origins from 2014, which carried the spirit of outlandish genre blending into new settings, and Puppet Master vs. Demonic Toys from 2004, which didn't hesitate to throw its killer puppets into new and bizarre scenarios. Beyond just the slasher space, Jason X was part of a wave of horror films that began to experiment with hybrid genres, mixing gore, sci-fi, and action in ways that would continue with films like The Toxin from 2015 and even The Void from 2016, which embraced that same kind of chaos and high concept premise. So while Jason's trip to the stars didn't launch a new wave of serious space horror, that crown belongs to the Alien series, Jason X did inspire filmmakers to take the familiar and push it into the stars. Sometimes with a machete, sometimes with a little more humor, but always with bloodshed. Jason X wasn't just about Jason running amok in space. It opened the door for horror to be anything but grounded in reality, giving filmmakers the courage to take their killers wherever they could imagine. Whether in space, in the future, or in parallel universes, Jason X demonstrated that horror doesn't have to stay confined to dark basements, campgrounds, or deserted woods. It can boldly go where no killer has gone before. 28 Days Later from 2002 redefined zombie horror, shaking up the genre in a way that hadn't been seen since George A. Romero's classics. Directed by Danny Boyle, the film introduced a new kind of zombie, fast, aggressive, and terrifyingly relentless. While Romero's zombies were slow, lumbering threats, 28 Days Later flipped the script with its rage zombies, infected with a virus that made them furious and capable of outrunning their victims. This change in zombie behavior, combined with a gritty, realistic atmosphere, made 28 Days Later feel like a fresh, terrifying reinvention of the genre, and it quickly became a cultural touchstone for the early 2000s horror landscape. More than just introducing fast-moving zombies, 28 Days Later also reintroduced the concept of the apocalypse as something more personal and immediate. Unlike the typical global catastrophe narrative of most zombie films, 28 Days Later focuses on a small group of survivors navigating a post-apocalyptic world in a decimated London. This intimacy, paired with a sense of isolation and the visual desolation of the empty city, gave the film a distinct emotional weight that set it apart from its predecessors. This was also one of the first films to fully capitalize on the notion of viral outbreaks spreading like wildfire, which would later become a staple in many post-apocalyptic and survival horror films. The film's impact on the genre was profound, influencing everything from the zombie resurgence in video games to the way apocalyptic horror stories were told. It breathed new life into the zombie genre. Dawn of the Dead from 2004, Zack Snyder's remake of the original classic, which featured similar fast-moving zombies and a much more visceral, action-packed tone. Films like The Crazies from 2010 and I Am Legend from 2007 also took notes from 28 Days Later portrayal of the collapse of society in the face of viral outbreaks, while movies like World War Z from 2013 would use the fast-moving, ferocious zombie concept to explore global pandemics. But the influence didn't stop at zombies. 28 Days Later also paved the way for the broader infected genre with films like The Horde from 2009 and Wreck from 2007, embracing the concept of viral infection, fast-paced terror, and a sense of helplessness. The film also pushed the boundaries of what could be done with practical effects and the depiction of human survival in extreme conditions. Even the bleak, desolate atmosphere would go on to influence dystopian films and series, with The Walking Dead from 2010 borrowing heavily from the emotional tone and intimate scale of the film's portrayal of human struggle in a fallen world. 28 Days Later's influence is still deeply felt today, not just in the world of zombie films, but in how horror can explore societal collapse, viral outbreaks, and human desperation. Ultimately, 28 Days Later was more than just a reinvention of zombie horror. It sparked a massive shift in the way horror films could approach apocalyptic scenarios, combining brutal violence with a deep sense of emotional gravity. It proved that the horror could be fast, frantic, and still offer moments of soul-crushing introspection. That legacy continues to echo in the genre, proving that when you take the undead, make them faster, and inject them with rage, you're probably in for a terrifyingly influential ride. The success of 28 Days, which upped the stakes by showing the aftermath of the outbreak spreading across Europe. This time, the story focused on attempts to contain the infection, showing how fragile the veneer of civilization truly is when a viral outbreak accelerates beyond control. While not directed by Boyle, 28 weeks later still carried over much of the first film's intensity and emotional weight, further exploring the themes of survival and the moral dilemmas that come with trying to rebuild a broken world. But that wasn't the end of the saga. Coming in later promises to continue the story with a new generation facing the fallout of the rage virus. While details are still under wraps, it's expected that this new installment will pick up the pieces of the shattered world from the first two films, exploring the ongoing consequences of the outbreak. What happens when society is left to rebuild in the wake of a global catastrophe? It's a story decades in the making, and fans are eagerly waiting to see how the franchise will evolve, especially as modern filmmaking technologies and global issues like pandemics shape the narrative in ways the original films couldn't have anticipated. The Ring from 2002 stands as one of the most influential horror films of the early 2000s, not just for its spine-chilling story, but for its mastery of psychological horror and the supernatural. Directed by Gore Verbinski and based on the Japanese film Ringu from '98, the film introduced Western audiences to the concept of cursed videotapes, a premise so eerie it became synonymous with the terror of watching and waiting. The film's slow burn pacing combined with its unsettling visuals, who could forget that hauntingly iconic well scene, tapped into our fear of the unknown, making something as mundane as watching a VHS tape feel like the gateway to our doom. What made The Ring truly groundbreaking was how it blended supernatural horror with a modern technological twist. In an era when technology was rapidly evolving, the idea of a cursed videotape that spreads death was disturbingly relevant. It tapped into the fears of modern media consumption, how easy it was to become complicit in something terrifying without even realizing it. This concept was so compelling that it created an entire subgenre of supernatural horror, one that thrives on the haunting media trope. Films like The Grudge from 2004, One Missed Call from 2008, and The Eye from 2002 all follow in The Ring's footsteps, bringing supernatural malevolence to the Western world, each in their own way blending folklore with the technology of modern life. The Ring didn't just leave an impression, it permanently altered how horror films approach supernatural horror. It made a statement about how fear is not always about monsters, but about the things that we can't control, especially the things we invite into our lives through technology. The film's success paved the way for other psychologically disturbing horror films that left viewers more terrified of what they couldn't see than what they could. In a broader sense, The Ring was part of the early 2000s J-horror wave's significant influence on American horror, where Asian horror films, with their distinct atmospheric and psychological sensibilities, inspired a slew of remakes and original films. The Ring in particular helped reinvigorate a genre that was growing stale, taking it in a direction that was both creepy and thought-provoking. Even later films like It Follows from 2014 and Sinister from 2012 owe some of their inspiration to The Ring's ability to turn the ordinary into something terrifying and to play with the notion that our actions, like simply watching a film or picking up a phone, can have deadly consequences. The Ring proved that horror doesn't need to rely on blood and gore to be terrifying. It just needs to make you question what might be lurking just out of sight, and whether it's already found you.
You ever notice how horror movies from 2000 to 2010 all had rules? Don't answer the phone, don't go into the woods, and of course, don't open the creepy antique box that your grandma left you. And yet, they always did it anyways. I mean, if my TV starts saying 7 days, I'm taking my whole entertainment system to Goodwill. Problem solved? But no, they'd rather investigate in the dark, alone. So here's the real rule. If you want to survive a horror movie from that decade, just stay home and maybe don't film anything on a shaky cam, all right? But hey, here's the fun in that. Watch all the bad decisions and the consequences with our 2000s horror classics marathon. You scream, they die. It's a win-win.
So Saw from 2004, directed by James Wan and written by Lee Winnell, is often credited with kickstarting the torture porn subgenre of horror. But its influence goes far beyond that narrow classification. It's introduced a new kind of psychological horror, blending graphic violence with intricate, morally complex storytelling. The film's legacy is intertwined with its ability to redefine the horror landscape and set the stage for a wave of gritty, disturbing films that focus on the human capacity for suffering, both physical and mental. What made Saw so influential was its unsettling, never-before-seen combination of a twisted moral puzzle and extreme horror. The film introduced audiences to the sadistic, yet philosophically minded villain John Kramer, aka the Jigsaw Killer, who forces his victims to engage in life-or-death games to test their will to live. These games, often involving gruesome, life-threatening traps, weren't just about blood and gore. Each trap was a reflection of the victim's own sins or failings, adding a layer of moral ambiguity to the carnage. This emphasis on psychological horror, guilt, and the consequences of one's actions created a sense of unease that went beyond just the shock of the violence. The narrative twist in the film's final moments was a game changer in terms of narrative structure and horror storytelling, leaving viewers stunned and eager to see where the story could go next. Saw's success led to a franchise with multiple sequels, and it quickly became a cultural phenomenon. The film's influence extended beyond just horror franchises as it shaped a wave of films focused on shocking, visceral experiences and convoluted plot twists. Movies like Hostel from 2005, The Devil's Rejects from 2005, and The Collector from 2009 followed in its steps, exploring extreme violence and psychological torment. But the impact didn't stop there. Saw also laid the foundation for a new kind of horror that wasn't just about monsters or ghosts. Instead, it made us confront the horrors of the human psyche, the consequences of moral failings, and the lengths to which people might go to survive. Moreover, Saw's success reinvigorated the horror genre after the dominance of slasher films in the 1980s and the rise of supernatural horror in the 1990s. The early 2000s had seen horror films struggle to find fresh ideas, but Saw tapped into something primal, the human fear of death, of being forced to confront one's own morality in the most horrific way imaginable. It also helped cement the rise of extreme horror during the 2000s, as filmmakers became increasingly interested in exploring the limits of human suffering and the darker side of the human condition. Its success on a modest budget also demonstrated the power of creative storytelling and the potential for independent films to make a massive cultural impact. Saw also introduced the concept of horror franchises built on a single overarching narrative, which was something of a departure from the standalone nature of earlier horror films. The series continued to explore the moral dilemmas posed by the Jigsaw Killer, and each new film introduced even more elaborate and brutal traps, while also delving deeper into the twisted, sometimes unrealistic, psychology of the characters. This approach to storytelling, where each installment unravels another layer of the puzzle, has influenced franchises such as the Conjuring series, the Purge films, and others that have built expansive, interconnected mythologies over time. While Final Destination also played with the concept of inevitable fate and sequels, Saw took the interconnected, serialized storytelling to a new level, with its intricate plot twists, shared universe, and moral themes that continue to evolve through multiple films. Saw didn't just inspire a wave of graphic, torturous horror films. It also reinvented the idea of what horror could be. It blended the psychological suspense with visceral, grotesque violence in ways that made the audience not only cringe, but question the very nature of survival, morality, and human nature itself. While its more extreme sequels are often seen as shock value for shock's sake, the original film's brilliance lies in how it made viewers uncomfortable on a deeper level, shifting the genre towards a more intellectual, disturbing type of fear. Its influence still ripples through modern horror today, from indie films to blockbuster franchises, proving that horror doesn't always need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes, the scariest thing is the human mind itself. Paranormal Activity from 2007 is one of the most influential horror films of the 21st century, largely because it redefined the found footage genre and ushered in a new wave of supernatural horror that would dominate the late 2000s and beyond. Directed by Oren Peli on a shoestring budget, the film used minimalistic storytelling to create maximum tension, focusing on a couple, Katie and Micah, who are haunted by a malevolent spirit in their home. The film's slow tension building approach, combined with its use of home video style footage, brought a fresh and terrifying intimacy to the genre, tapping into our most primal fears of being watched and haunted in our own spaces. What made Paranormal Activity so impactful was how it played on the fear of the unknown, using subtle, almost imperceptible scares, creaky doors, flickering lights, and objects moved without explanation, to gradually build a sense of dread. Unlike the more visceral horror films of the time, this movie didn't rely on gore or jump scares, but rather on the idea that something was quietly, unrelentingly happening just beyond the frame. The film's use of static, night vision cameras, and the first-person perspective put the audience in the shoes of the characters, making every creak and every groan of the house feel personal, as if the supernatural was creeping into the viewer's own life. Paranormal Activity also helped to revitalize the found footage genre, which had been dormant since the Blair Witch Project of '99. The film's unexpected commercial success showed that audiences were hungry for a new, more realistic form of horror. It made low-budget filmmaking cool again, and Hollywood quickly took notice. The film's influence can be seen in a host of subsequent horror films, including The Last Exorcism of 2010, As Above, So Below from 2014, and The Visit from 2015. Even bigger productions like The Conjuring 2013 owe something to Paranormal Activity's approach of building tension and creating a sense of claustrophobic fear within the confines of a home. Beyond that, Paranormal Activity contributed to the resurgence of supernatural horror and the rise of the haunted house subgenre in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It paved the way for other films that combined ghost stories with the personal, intimate atmosphere. It also spawned a franchise that kept expanding the mythology with sequels, prequels, and spin-offs, cementing the series as a staple of modern horror. Perhaps most importantly, Paranormal Activity influenced the way horror films could be marketed. With its viral campaign and promise of genuine scares, the film encouraged audiences to share their experiences and created a sense of collective participation. The grassroots style of marketing, coupled with the film's DIY aesthetic, tapped into a new generation of horror fans who wanted to feel like they were a part of the new experience, blurring the lines between fiction and reality in ways that felt raw and real. Paranormal Activity didn't just bring back the found footage genre, it reinvented it. It proved that the most terrifying thing isn't necessarily what's in front of you, but what's just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The film's minimalistic approach to horror is still felt today in countless other movies that follow in its footsteps. Whether it's the use of home video terror or the slow burn supernatural scares, Paranormal Activity helped redefine what it means to be haunted. The Strangers from 2007 is one of those horror films that crawls under your skin and stays there long after the credits roll. Directed by Brian Bertino, the film is a masterclass in tension, fear, and the terrifyingly mundane. What makes it so influential is its raw, stripped-down approach to terror. Unlike the supernatural horrors of slasher tropes dominating the genre at the time, The Strangers taps into the primal fear of home invasion. The idea that your own sanctuary can be shattered by unrelenting, faceless strangers. This makes the horror feel disturbingly real because it's not about zombies, demons, or creatures. It's about people, and how easily a seemingly safe place can become a death trap. The film's pacing is another key element. The creeping slow burn tension, followed by moments of sudden chaotic violence, creates a rhythm that keeps audiences on edge. This style of horror, where everything feels fragile and nothing is truly safe, has been echoed in a slew of home invasion thrillers and horrors that followed. It laid the groundwork for films like The Purge from 2013, Your Next from 2011, and even The Strangers Prey at Night from 2018, which carried the home invasion theme forward. But beyond that, The Strangers also influenced a wider trend in horror that embraced isolation and stripped down terror, which can be seen in films like The Invitation from 2015 and It Comes at Night from 2017. One of the most significant contributions The Strangers made to the genre was its portrayal of the antagonist's motives, or lack thereof. The killers aren't given a backstory or explanation, which makes them even more terrifying. It's an embodiment of randomness, showing that danger doesn't always need a reason. The chilling tagline from The Strangers, "Because You Were Home," is a reminder that sometimes the scariest things can happen when you're simply minding your own business. Now, nearly 2 decades later, The Strangers has been reimagined in The Strangers Chapter 1 from 2024, directed by Rennie Harlan. This film serves as the first installment in a planned trilogy, taking the original concept and expanding it into a larger, more intricate story. Starring Madeleine Petsch as Maya and Froy Gutierrez as Ryan, the film follows a young couple traveling cross-country to start a new life. When their car breaks down in a remote town in Oregon, they are forced to spend the night in an isolated Airbnb, only to be stalked and terrorized by the same mass intruders that haunted the 2007 film. Now, while The Strangers Chapter 1 sticks closely to the formula that made the original so effective, it also aims to deepen the mythology surrounding the mass killers. This installment is the beginning of a trilogy that will further explore the events leading up to and following this horrifying night, potentially shedding new light on the killer's origins or motivations. However, much like its predecessor, Chapter 1 leans into the eerie randomness of home invasion horror, where the terror comes not from supernatural forces, but from the unsettling reality that anyone can be a target. Although the film has received mixed reviews, including my own, which you can watch, some praising its return to a slow burn dread of the original, while others feel it lacks significant innovation. It reaffirms the lasting impact of the Strangers franchise. With more sequels on the way, The Strangers Chapter 1 is setting the stage for a new era of home invasion horror, proving that the fear of the faceless, motiveless terror is just as potent now as it was in 2007. Insidious 2010 isn't just another haunted house movie. It's a psychological, supernatural nightmare that helped reshape modern horror. Directed by James Wan, the film took a familiar genre and turned it on its head, blending atmospheric dread with a chilling new concept: astral projection. The story follows a family whose son Dalton falls into a coma and becomes trapped in a dark, terrifying realm called the Further, a dimension inhabited by malevolent spirits. What makes Insidious so influential is its ability to inject fresh life into the ghost story genre by introducing a metaphysical twist that went beyond typical ghostly hauntings. The film's blend of eerie visuals, suspenseful pacing, and unique mythology opened the door for a new wave of supernatural horror that relied more on mood and atmosphere than on traditional scares. One of the film's most important contributions was its tone and pacing. Whereas most horror films at the time were leaning into jump scares or graphic gore, Insidious created a sense of lingering dread, relying heavily on psychological tension to keep the audience on edge. It utilized the power of suggestion, sound design, and a slow burn narrative to pull the audiences deeper into the story. The ghosts in Insidious weren't just creepy spirits. They were part of a much larger, otherworldly force, and the film was unafraid to explore the unknown, blending horror with the supernatural. This approach influenced many films that followed, particularly within the demon haunting subgenre, which would explode in popularity throughout the 2010s. Films like the Conjuring series from 2013 followed in Insidious's footsteps, relying on similar techniques of atmospheric tension and a slow unraveling of supernatural lore. Wan himself directed The Conjuring, while Annabelle 2014 was directed by John R. Leonetti, but still benefited from Wan's involvement as a producer. These films not only borrowed from the Insidious formula, but they also expanded on the idea of a shared horror universe that could trace its roots back to Insidious's unsettling demonology. The success of Insidious helped lay the groundwork for films like Sinister from 2012, which similarly focused on creepy otherworldly forces, and The Babadook in 2014, which took a more psychological approach, but shared the same undercurrent of dark supernatural terror. Additionally, Insidious's unique ability to create an emotional connection with the audience made it stand apart from other supernatural horror films. Rather than focusing entirely on shock value, the film's emotional undercurrent, centered on a family trying to save their child from a nightmarish fate, made the horror feel more personal and more relatable. This has since become a defining feature of many supernatural horrors, whether it's the haunting of a family, such as in The Conjuring, or the struggle to protect loved ones from an evil force, like in Hereditary from 2018. Beyond its influence on specific films, Insidious helped reignite a broader resurgence in supernatural horror, where the focus shifted away from gore-heavy, slasher-oriented plots to something far darker and more subtle, turning the genre into a more cerebral, terrifying experience. The film proved that horror could be deeply imaginative, psychological, and emotionally charged, and it set a new standard for how we approach horror from the other side of life and death. This evolution not only shaped a new era of supernatural films, but also showed that audiences were hungry for films that made them think as much as it made them scream. And finally, our last film, Under the Skin from 2013, directed by Jonathan Glazer and based on the novel by Michael Faber, stands as one of the most daring, unsettling, and influential sci-fi horror films of the 21st century. Its unique blend of stark minimalist storytelling, surreal visuals, and a chilling existential atmosphere has left a lasting mark on both the horror and science fiction genres. The film follows an alien played by Scarlett Johansson who lures unsuspecting men to their doom, and it explores themes of alienation, identity, and the human condition through an avant-garde lens. Its slow burn narrative and reliance on mood over traditional plot mechanics gave Under the Skin a cerebral quality that set it apart from more conventional horror films. One of the film's most influential aspects is its hauntingly sparse and unconventional use of sound and visuals. The film's score, composed by Mika Levi, uses dissonant, otherworldly sounds to create a sense of unease, mirroring the alien presence in the human world. This approach to sound design and atmosphere has influenced films like The Witch from 2015, where unsettling soundscapes similarly drive the horror, and Annihilation from 2018, which blends a body horror and an eerie ambient soundtrack to reflect its own alien world. The film's abstract narrative and exploration of body horror also paved the way for more experimental horror, inspiring films like The Neon Demon from 2016, which similarly delves into the grotesque and explores the fragility of human identity. Under the Skin's subversion of traditional horror tropes also influenced directors like Ari Aster, whose Midsummer 2019 blends folk horror with deeply unsettling emotional and psychological themes, and Robert Eggers, whose The Lighthouse from 2019 plays with isolation, madness, and the unknown in a way that echoes Under the Skin's haunting, elusive nature. Now, what truly sets Under the Skin apart is its ability to combine the quiet dread of psychological horror with the unnerving vastness of cosmic horror. The sense that the protagonist, an alien in disguise, is simultaneously a predator and a spectator forces the viewer to confront the idea of existence from a detached, almost godlike perspective. It's a film that pushes boundaries, making us question not just the nature of horror, but the very nature of our humanity, leaving its unsettling imprint on anyone who dares to look. This film is not just a visual experience, it's a sensory and psychological journey that influenced many filmmakers to push the boundaries of horror into more experimental, ambiguous territories, helping redefine what horror can be in the 21st century. And there it is, my wicked friends. Part 4 is done, but don't breathe easy, not yet. The darkness has only just begun to creep in. The early 2000s, that's when horror stopped being something you watched and started becoming something you felt. Monsters that stalk you long after you turn the lights out. Killers that invade your dreams, your home, your very soul. Think you've seen it all? Trust me, you haven't even scratched the surface. See, I told you, it's getting darker. But don't go running just yet, my little thrill seekers. Part 5 is creeping closer, and it's not going to play fair. No. This next chapter will make you question what's real and what's waiting for you in the dark. We're talking spirits that invade your home, bloodthirsty clowns that dance with terror, and creatures we once knew as innocent, now ready to rip your world apart. You won't know who or what to trust, and the worst part? You will never see them coming. Now, like this video if you're brave enough to face what's coming next. Subscribe if you want more nightmares, and hit that bell because the terror is about to claw its way into your life, and you won't want to miss it. And remember, when the air goes cold and you feel that presence lurking just beyond your reach, don't look back. They're already there.